Retreat. Left microphone. Did we lose the people?
Gatha on opening the sutra. The Dharma incomparably profound and infinitely subtle is rarely encountered even in millions of ages. Now we see it, hear it, receive and maintain it. May we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glorious October session Friday, is it not? I mean, could it be any more perfect? The other day I was like, oh man, the cicadas are gone. All summer we listened to the cicadas proclaiming the Dharma. And then that first night of session, Thursday night, it was cold, it was dark, there were no cicadas. And now we have the teisho of the rustling leaves. And so much has shifted in the environment since September session. Do you remember in September session when we talked about the beautiful albatross who flies and dreams and sleeps while it flies? And we were going to stop all our flapping and just open our wings and glide on the Dharma winds. And I feel like that carried right into this session because there's been so much ease. You can really feel everybody practicing in ease with just so much churn in the world and our lives. But that wonderful ease that we practice together, we stay out of the way of. letting it be. Last night when Doan Roshi was sharing those beautiful inspirational words in the Zendo when it was dark and there were no cicadas, what really struck me was when she talked about the privilege that it is to be allowed to be in this space together. And how when we look around the room, the miracle of all these causes and conditions coming together, giving us the opportunity to be together in this way, to practice in this ancient tradition. And we're so lucky. I often think October session is my favorite, and then January comes, and March, and July, and Rahatsu. But there is something about October where the change is just so in your face. You can't help but contemplate impermanence and to experience it directly. And so this October, we're coming off of a season of a lot of discussion about death. We lost our noble friend Soke this summer. In my own family, we are talking about death a lot. My mom has cancer, and it's in her skeleton and all of her bones. And it's not easy practice. It's not easy to feel that grief rise up. And it's not easy to contemplate our own very real mortality. And sometimes it's not easy to be with each other or our families in these times with grief and what unfolds. But with our practice, we're able to, even when it's hard. And it's not too much of a segue to think about death, to fear, right? The fear of death is pretty universal. I was trying to decide what to talk about earlier in the week, and I was actually visiting my mom in the hospital, and one of the things that helps her a lot when she's in pain is the distraction of chit-chat. I'm not really actually that great at the chit-chat. I mean, I think my mom probably finds my chit-chat a little irreverent, maybe a little irrelevant also. But she was missing her pain meds, like she was off by several hours of dosing, so I was what she had. And so I was chit-chatting with her, and I was just talking about temple and temple life and what I might talk about on Friday. And when I said I might talk about fear, she actually kind of straightened herself up a little bit, which isn't easy because she's got a lot of tumors in her bones. And she said, I would like to hear about that. I was like, well, it'll be pretty Buddhist-y. But, I've been with my mom and my family through a lot of fear lately, the fear of pain and the fear of death. And in the past 2 years, we've been having the Lamrim class, and we talk about what motivates us to actually dig into this practice. And that fear of death and fear of pain and the fears can be so wholesome and so motivating for our practice. And so we really have to appreciate that and have gratitude for all of that when it comes up. We just had a workshop on Saturday for Ango, and our teachers invited the disciples and Shuso Kosho to share some of our experiences with fear in the context of the Ango theme of lotus in the fire. And it was a discussion-based workshop, and many of you were there. And wasn't it interesting how universal and unique our own experiences are in this area? it just feels like these days, everywhere we go, there's churn in every place we contact. The world is actually on fire. And how are we being in that lotus in the fire without fear? Or with fear, but still being the lotus in the fire. We all have our own circumstances and situations with that. And we all deal with fear of failure and fear of success and fear of being seen and fear of not being seen and fear of being alone and fear of being with too many people, fear of being not good enough, fear of ridicule, being liked, not liked. I mean, we're like experts in finding the fear. And when we talk about fear, it's not always so obvious. I mean, there is fear that is, the panic, terror, blood runs cold fear. But then during this talk, I just really encourage you to think about all the other ways fear shows up, right? As worry, anxiety, trepidation, fretting. These fears all come up as we try to protect something. We're trying to protect this false sense of self from perceived threat. And so, because it's this universal experience, people study fear a lot. You can look at fear from a psychological perspective, biological. Even the little amoebas have fear and they get away from the thing that might eat them if they can, and they try to get the food that they need. We're all just trying to survive this way. So I found some interesting science, and I think science brings a lot to the Dharma talk. So here's some interesting science about fears. Humans are actually, I guess, born with two innate fears, and they aren't like the ones you might think of, like fear of death and fear of pain. But they're actually fear of falling, I guess, and fear of loud noises. So babies are born and they have that startle reflex, right? But also, once they're crawling, if there's like a fake cliff on the ground, they won't crawl over that. They're not doing that. They're not gonna fall down there. So there's this really beneficial fact of fear, like we keep ourselves safe. We don't get eaten by the tiger, we don't go over the imaginary cliff, we don't stay away from the loud noises. And then there's also fears that are they've actually been built into our DNA through evolution. So we have this ability to recognize like a snake pattern better than other patterns. Like we can pick out that mosaic pattern of a snake that we need to avoid. So we kind of pass those fears on in our DNA and in our, like, watch out for that snake, kids. Don't die of the snake bite. And then we have just all these other fears that we just bring up out of the poisons, out of the greed and the anger and the ignorance as we try to protect ourselves. And those are the ones that we can do a lot of work on. Like we can actually liberate ourselves from those. Oh, but I want to tell you some more science, actually, because I learned a little bit about the amygdala. Big word, right, Shugen? Yes, thank you. Almond-sized piece of the brain where the fear is recognized. Good job, right? Exactly the anatomy definition, I'm sure. Little piece of the brain. But what's really interesting about this is that sends a signal to our bones. Like when we feel that fear in our bones, we actually are feeling it in our bones. Our bones put out a hormone. Should I use another good word? Okay, I gotta look down and see where I wrote it down though. Osteocalcin. The osteocalcin travels through your body, hits the adrenal glands, and sends out that fight or flight. And I love all that, but what I really think is so interesting is that it's coming from our bones, from our actual marrow. We are so hardwired to have this fear response that it comes from our bone marrow, our marrow. And that's also where we can experience the most liberation in our actual marrow, our very being. And we have a lot of language around this that we use. We talk about you need to have a spine in these situations. You got to have a backbone to have courage. And it's actually true. And, Rinzai Roshi's been doing bodywork classes on Saturdays once a month. And the last one was about spinal health. And next Saturday, there'll be another one about the spine also. And you've probably heard him teaching about that Vajra power that is the spine. And I'm just always, aren't we so excited when the science and the Dharma are just so obviously wonderful together? So we practice with our posture all the time here. We practice with that noble, upright posture, the Vajra power of the spine. Practice liberating ourselves from the fear, letting the bones calm down. Don't make all that osteocalcin. We don't need it. Not all the time, anyways. So because we are hardwired to experience fear, and even in the Buddhist time, before they knew about osteocalcin, the Buddha understood that there's what are called underlying tendencies that we have. We don't need to eliminate them. We have an underlying tendency to fear, amongst many other things. We don't need to eliminate it, but we need to understand it in the context that's appropriate. So it's just another sensation arising. Sensations arise all the time and fall away. And we don't need to feed it. We don't need to play with it. And we need to recognize the wholesome and the unwholesome fears. Again, if you're in the Lam-Rim class, you've heard a lot of teachings over the past 2 years about wholesome and unwholesome, and mindfulness being the ability to tell the difference. If you're not in the Lam-Rim class yet, I really recommend you do it in January. It has been very beneficial to study these teachings together. So when we look in the Pali Canon to see what the Buddha taught about fear, really a lot. It's all over the place in the Pali Canon. And the Buddha is very clear that the source of the fear is our greed, anger, and ignorance. We don't want it, we must have it. We falsely believe we have this fixed sense that we have to protect. And that's why we come and we practice, to dissolve that, to soften that, and eventually to see through it. And I think in this, when you are considering this and think about Doan Roshi's words last night about finding that place of truth before you start telling the story, that kind of gets at it, doesn't it? So jumping into the big fear, the fear of death, I've brought us a passage out of the Pali Canon. Oh, this is another thing. This was great. This is another reason I wanted to share this story, not because it is a great story and a wonderful teaching, but in the numerical discourses, that book is this thick. And I open right to this page. That's satisfying. Thank you. That's satisfying. So we'll hear it. This is from the numerical discourses of the fours. So it's not quite exactly that impressive because the book goes 1 through 10, and I didn't know it was in the fours. So I kind of 40% the way through. All right. Here we are, fearless. Then the Brahmin, Janusani, went up to the Buddha and exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he sat down to one side and said to the Buddha, "Master Gautama, this is my doctrine and view. All those liable to death are frightened and terrified of death." And I just liked this intro because it reminded me so much of how we are at the temple. It's like, hey, how are you? Let's talk about death. polite greetings, now let's talk about the death. I've actually had that situation here many times. All right, so let's talk about death. And the Buddha then says, Brahman, some of those liable to death are frightened and terrified of death, but some of those liable to death are not frightened and terrified of death. And I'm only going to read half because, the Pali Canon tells you that the one way and then it just turns it around and does the other way. So we'll just talk about who are those not frightened of death? Who are those not frightened? It's someone who is rid of greed, desire, fondness, thirst, passion, and craving for sensual pleasures. When they fall seriously ill, they don't think, the sensual pleasures that I love so much will leave me and I'll leave them. Thus they don't sorrow and wail and lament, beating their breast and falling into confusion. This is someone who's not frightened of death. Furthermore, it's someone who is rid of greed, desire, fondness, thirst, passion, and craving for the body. When they fall seriously ill, they don't think, this body that I love so much will leave me and I'll leave it. So they don't sorrow and wail and lament, beating their breast and falling into confusion. This too is someone who's not frightened of death. So these first two parts are talking about our desire and our greed, resolving those. And then furthermore, those not frightened of death are someone who hasn't done bad, violent, and corrupt deeds, but has done good and skillful deeds that keep them safe. When they fall seriously ill, they think, well, I haven't done bad, violent, and corrupt things. I have done good and skillful deeds. Thus, they don't sorrow and wail and lament. They don't beat their breast and fall into confusion. This is someone who's not frightened of death. And so here we talk about virtuous behavior, right? And receiving the precepts and keeping the precepts. And I think about how frequently Rinzin Roshi reminds us that when you're practicing wholesomely with virtuous behavior, you wake up not in fear. You wake up feeling good when you're relying on that refuge and precepts and virtuous behavior. Furthermore, it's someone who is not doubtful, uncertain, or undecided about the true teaching. And again, when they fall seriously ill, they don't have this wailing and lamenting and confusion. This too is someone who's not frightened of death. These are the four people not liable to death who are not frightened and not terrified of death. So we work on the hindrances, the hindrance of skeptical doubt. We practice the virtues, and we practice together on that greed, anger, and ignorance. And then, of course, the Brahman. Excellent Master Gautama, from this day forth, may Master Gautama remember me as a lay follower who has gone for refuge for life. So that fear of death, that wholesome fear, that really does bring us to practice. It's really the thing I think that brought me to my practice. I was very, very scared when I came to the temple, very sick. I think I was, lamenting, wailing, beating my breast, and falling into confusion quite a bit. I was really in quite a state. And there's boundless gratitude for that there is a place that we come to in these states and practice together. And so there's this aspect of fearlessness, I think, that comes with practice. I was actually always a very scared kid, too. Not in terms of climbing the slide or, being in the play or something, but when I was alone, this spooky fear would just kind of run up my spine, and I would like maybe run from room to another room where other people were, or just jump out of the shower and like not be able to finish. I would get very spooked. And I mean, really, that was into my 20s and maybe a tiny bit in my 30s even, until I got very sick and very scared. So sometimes, actually recently, a few people have asked me, like, how do you know this practice is working? Right? How do we know? And first, I always give them the same answer that Doan Roshi gave me when I asked her that question several years ago. It's just easier to love people, right? It's easier to love people. But then I also come up to this place of fearlessness. You know, you start to notice this true fearlessness that isn't about denying the fear or stuffing it down, but this calm abiding in the circumstances. I remember, I don't know, it must have been a while ago, I was walking with Kosei. I mean, she was a teenager. She must have been like 13 or 14. And we were, I think I was in my little scooter. I don't think I was walking. She was walking, we were out. And we passed this person gardening, and this man was making this really creative, lovely garden. And I just started admiring it and talking to him, and we went past him then, and she was, and I'd been practicing for a little while, and she was just like, she brought it up. She said, "Mubby, you are so fearless now." And I didn't realize how much that was really affecting. You know, I was a mother, and you protect your kids, and for her to see that difference of like, wow, you're so fearless, that really got my attention, because like I said, I'd been a very fearful person. You know, this fear of being alone and feeling so, I don't know what that is. It was some karmic fears, I think, just always present, that no longer were around. And I hadn't even, they kind of disappeared so slowly. I don't think I even noticed until she said that. You know how you have these moments in your practice where somebody else observes something and you're like, whoa, this practice does work. That was one of them for me. The other day I was at the hospital also. This is, I think, I'm not sure why this feels relevant, but it really does. I was leaving the hospital 11, maybe 10 o'clock at night. It was dark and cold. And this little girl was coming out of the hospital with her parents. I mean, little, maybe four or less. And it's 10 o'clock at night. She can't have had a great day in the hospital, right? And she's, I don't know, she starts walking beside me like we know each other. And we're, you know, her parents are kind of chuckling behind her, but we're walking together. And she looked up, and she had a little stuffed animal in her hand, and I had some flowers that my mom wasn't allowed to have, and so I was taking them home. And she just looked up with that, you know, the purity that just a little child has, that fearless moment. And she just smiled, and I said, "Oh, I like what you have in your hands. Do you like what I have?" And she loved, like she just loved it. It was that moment of connection, of that human connection where there is no fear and there's nothing in the way. You know, those pure interactions. And it was a really lovely moment after a really hard evening of talking about fear up in the hospital room. So this fearlessness, again, is not about denying anything, right? It's about looking right at it, not turning away, not pretending it doesn't exist, but just being deeply intimate with it. You know, I like how Pema Chodron talks about fear when she tells us we have to smile at the fear. We have to be familiar with it. We have to be intimate. We have to be kind to ourselves about it. It's a wonderful teacher, fear. So we're at session. Maybe we've encountered some fears, anxieties, trepidations, worries, fretting, upsetness on the cushion or otherwise. Maybe it's come up. So I actually want to bring up a second story from the Pali Canon. It was called something, and I don't remember the name of it, but what I think it should be called is Buddha's exposure therapy, pre-enlightenment. Okay? So this is the Buddha talking. The thought occurred to me, what if on recognized designated nights, such as the 8th, 14th, and 15th of the lunar fortnight, to be specific, I went to stay in the sort of places that are awe-inspiring and make your hair stand on end, such as park shrines, forest shrines, and tree shrines. And see, this reminded me of that feeling I used to have as a young person. Just being alone, my hair would stand on end. So perhaps I would get to see that fear and terror. So at a later time, on recognized designated nights, I did stay in these sorts of places that make your hair stand on end. And while I was there, a wild animal would come, or a peacock would make a twig fall, or wind would rustle the fallen leaves. The thought would occur to me, is this that fear and terror coming? And then the thought occurred to me, why do I just keep waiting for fear? That's pretty relatable. What if I, in whatever state I'm in when fear and terror come to me, were to subdue that fear and terror in that very state? So when fear and terror came to me while I was walking back and forth, I would not stand or sit or lie down. I would keep walking back and forth until I had subdued that fear. And then the same for sitting, lying down, not distracting, not looking away, actually touching it and staying with it as a sensation that's arising in mind, empty, and letting it dissipate. I would keep sitting until I have subdued that fear and terror. Unflagging persistence was aroused in me, and unmeddled mindfulness established. My mind was calm and unaroused, my mind concentrated and single. That's a solid exposure therapy on the cushion. In Zazen, we face ourself over and over and over again. The fears, anxieties, nervousness, terrors, as well as all the more pleasurable things, but we just face it over and over again. There's nowhere to go. You are here with yourself, just you, on the cushion, in deep exposure therapy. And so when we find that place of the truth, before we begin telling the story, not feeding the fear, not playing with it, letting it arise, giving it a touch, giving it a kiss, letting it go. This is our practice. And this is why we're so lucky to have the privilege to be able to be here doing it, to have the circumstances to make the space, to give the time, to give the energy and the love to this practice at session, and taking it from session into our world, which fires everywhere, and being able to abide there. think it's important to think about how many ways we can practice with this. When I was telling that story about the fearlessness that Kosei noticed, my primary practice at that time was white Tara. And I think if you talk to anyone here who practices Tara, I'm sure has had the experience of the practice of the mantra and practice with Tara, just cutting through that fear and allowing space to abide in fearlessness. There's a line in the Tara sadhana. We say, her right hand gestures an invitation to liberation, giving courage and assurance to those dominated by fears, giving rest to those who are heavy burdened. And that's just her right hand. Her left hand indicates the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, reminding us not to be satisfied with samsaric delights. So Tara is a power combo. And if you haven't practiced Tara, you should definitely come to the sadhanas on Sundays. And experience that. When I was getting ready to have my lung transplant, that's kind of a fearful moment. And yet it entirely wasn't for me. I'm so grateful that the fear I had in my illness brought me into the temple and gave me that opportunity to practice and to have that relationship with Tara that I could lean into when it was time to talk about all the things they were going to be doing to my body. It was actually, I think it was better than Xanax in that moment, because I didn't really need anything like that because of the trust that I had in that time from the practice. And I think at this temple in particular, we're very lucky that we have so many ways to work with this. Sitting on our cushions in the zazen, exposure therapy, staying with it, the Lam Rim teachings on fear and Tara practice, and just being together in this really warm way. The Buddha I have on my home altar, my personal altar, is the Fearless Buddha. Do you all know Fearless Buddha? He sits there like this mudra. You should try this. Straighten your spine. Get the Vajra power going. Okay, feel that openness in your spine. The occipit's upright and the spinal, your tailbone is tucked under. And then you bring the one hand up to the shoulder with a relaxed hand, and the other rests on the leg, open. Open and relaxed. The hands reflect the mind. The hands are relaxed and open and free. When I was a midwife, I used to have to tell a lot of women that there's a connection between the jaw and the pelvic floor, and if you're doing this, it's hard to get a baby out. And I think when we're doing this, it's hard to feel the freedom from fear. And when you do this, you can really feel it. Just that open. Liberated. Free of hindrances. No hindrance in the mind, no hindrance, and therefore no fear. So it is exquisite outside, and we have extended kinhin. And I really encourage everybody to go outside, even if you're not going to walk the trail. Go sit outside. Listen to the teisho of the rustling leaves. Feel the sun on your body. Take it all in as nourishment. Nourishment for your practice, nourishment for each other, for the session. And I'll just leave you with a line from Shantideva, from the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. If there were truly an existent I, it would make sense to be afraid of certain things. But since there is no truly existent I, who is there to be afraid? Dedicate the merit of this Dharma talk to all those who are living in great fear today, to all those who are alone, without noble friends, to those whose lives are in true danger, to all those who will die on this day, especially those who will die in fear. May our merit go to all of them, to all beings, throughout space and time, for full and complete enlightenment in this lifetime, without exception. May it be so.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. inaccessible.